ever wondered how our body makes urine? Well, I hope at the end of this video that you have a better understanding of how our kidney filters our blood and creates urine. So, as we jump into this today, we need to go over the gross anatomy of the kidney to understand what we're talking about. So, our kidney, we have two of them, and they're located in that lower right and left quadrants of our abdomen. And we have this key artery here called the renal artery that brings blood to our kidneys. And our kidneys its main job is to filter the blood to create urine. And so this renal artery will go, and it's pretty thick when it begins, but then it starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And if we zoom in, we can actually see how it goes all the way to this light pink structure called the renal cortex. And this renal cortex here is where the functional unit of the kidney lives, which is called the nephron, which is this yellow structure that you see right here. Right below we have the cortex is this upper part. In this part called the pyramid, the renal pyramid, it's also called the renal medulla. So the blood goes all the way to these functional units, and through this long process of filtration and reabsorption, you create urine. And it gets all the waste products and excess fluid and things that we need to eventually pee out. And so the pee will eventually come down and go down this collecting duct all the way down to the papillary duct to dump into the minor calyx, which is the smaller white portion that you see kind of here, into the major calyx, which is the thicker portion of the tube here, eventually down into the renal pelvis. And from the renal pelvis, it'll go down and go through the ureter, which is this tube here. You have two ureters, and they'll end up going down to the bladder, where the urine is stored and awaits excretion. So that is generally how the kidney functions. Our first step of the way to understanding how this process actually happens is diving into the functional unit, aka the nephron. So diving into the nephron here, we have key sections that are anatomically divided, and each section of the nephron has a unique function. Our first part here, we want to zoom in, we can actually see the circular part where the blood flow starts coming in. It's called the glomerulus. So the glomerulus is the main part where the filtration happens, where urine is first created. Everything else past this point is all reabsorption, further refinement of the urine before it eventually gets excreted. Right after this part, we have this part known as the proximal convoluted tubule. And the proximal convoluted tubule is where the majority of the reabsorption happens of the nutrients, the salt, the water, the bicarbonate, the glucose, all the good stuff your body loves and needs and it doesn't want to pee out happens right there. Next up, we move on to the nephron loop, also known as the loop of Henle. And so this loop is where the water and salt refinement happens. A lot of the salt reabsorption happens in the ascending part, and the water reabsorption happens in the descending part right here. And so the urine will make its way down the loop, all the way down the loop of Henle, and then it goes to the distal convoluted tubule, and then eventually down and emptying into the collecting duct. By the time it gets to the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, a lot of the refinement process has already happened. These two structures are mainly focused on responding to hormones and to that fine tuning of electrolyte balance, acid-base balance, and making sure that the urine is adequately everything important is out of the urine before you actually pee it out. So now that we are a little more comfortable with the actual nephron, let's dive into the specifics of the glomerulus. Alright, so here's our glomerulus. I know it might look a little complicated at first, but stay with me. I'm going to explain it in a way that kind of makes sense, and we'll go through it nice and slow. And so we'll start with the blood flow. This is really important. So we have an afferent arteriole and an efferent arteriole. Afferent means going towards, efferent means going away. It's the same name as the nerves, like afferent being our sensory nerves and efferent being our motor nerves, like in our spinal cord. Same thing. So all it's saying is the blood's coming in through the afferent arteriole and exiting the efferent arteriole. And you see how the blood will travel all the way through in a very long, winding fashion. It's called the glomerular arteriole. And it'll keep on going, and the blood makes its journey all the way through. And there's a lot of surface area in here because a lot of filtration needs to happen. This is our main filtration hub, and so that's why this is so long. And so eventually then the blood will leave the efferent arteriole to go back to eventually get drained into the renal vein and get brought back to the body. Surrounding this entire artery is the Bowman's capsule. And so this yellow and black part here, this is the Bowman's capsule. It's a strong structure that is surrounding the entire glomerulus, and it makes up that outer portion. It has two parts. As you can see, if we zoom in, we have the glomerular outer membrane called the Bowman's capsule, and then a small parietal layer of cells. So zooming in, let's talk about filtration. So imagine we're a blood cell, we're traveling along, and we want to get to this white empty space here, as the eventual urine will collect in this empty or white space. So from the blood to the empty white space, we have to cross three barriers. So there's three layers that make up the filter of the glomerulus. The first layer they're going to run into is the endothelial cells of the glomerular arteriole. So the endothelial it's basically the cells that make up the wall of the actual artery. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is going to be a basement membrane. This is the yellow part. And then this blue part here are the podocytes with pedicels, which are Latin for foot, or feet almost. And they kind of look like feet when you look at them, or in some images and things like that. All the filtrate has to get through those 3 layers to get to urine here, to make the urine here. And so once that all gets filtered out, it'll eventually drain it to go to the proximal convoluted tubule like we talked about after it's all filtered. Now, we can't talk about the glomerulus without talking about these 3 important structures over here at the very beginning of this all happening. And we're going to start with our juxtaglomerular cells. The juxtaglomerular cells are these green guys that I've drawn, and these are cells located only on the afferent arteriole. And their main job is to store renin, the enzyme renin. And the renin kicks off the RAAS, or the RAS pathway, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. And eventually, if that gets secreted, it increases your blood pressure. And so it's very key for renin storage right here. Also, we have to talk about these purple cells here. So we have 2 types of purple cells in this glomerulus. We have intraglomerular mesangial cells, which are in the glomerulus, which kind of makes sense. And then extraglomerular mesangial cells, which exist outside of the actual circle itself. And they are located in between the afferent and the efferent arterioles. They have 2 distinct functions, so that we can talk about the intraglomerular mesangial cells first. These are mainly for structural support, right? So they help to structurally support the actual structure of the glomerulus, help to support the arteriole that's in there, and then also has a role in cleaning up all the filtrate, keeping the filter clean, really. When we talk about our extraglomerular mesangial cells, these guys are very important for regulating the vasodilation and vasoconstriction of the afferent arteriole to either increase or decrease the blood flow that is coming into the glomerulus to regulate the glomerular filtration rate, or the GFR. These orange cells over here are specialized epithelial cells. They're a part of the distal convoluted tubule, which could be part of the same nephron or a different nephron that runs in between the afferent and the efferent arteriole. And the specialized cells are called the macula densa. They have a very important role, and their role is to sense the amount of sodium and chloride in the urine as it's traveling by within the distal convoluted tubule. And it has a very important role in the entire blood pressure regulation of this system. For example, if the macula densa cells sense an increase in sodium, or a lot of sodium in the urine, that would indicate that there's a lot of filtration going on, maybe the blood pressure's too high. And it actually communicate with the extraglomerular mesangial cells to vasoconstrict the afferent arteriole to decrease the blood flow going through the glomerulus and decreasing the rate, therefore reestablishing normal sodium channels flowing through the distal convoluted tubule. So it's almost like the end of the process almost influences the beginning of the process. So it's a self-regulating system. And this whole system is called the JGA that I've represented here, called the juxtaglomerular apparatus, okay? And that, again, makes up the juxtaglomerular cells of the afferent arteriole, the extraglomerular mesangial cells, and the macula densa cells of the distal convoluted tubule. Those 3 things make up the juxtaglomerular apparatus, which again is responsible for regulating the systemic blood pressure and controlling the overall rate of blood filtration through the kidney. So now that we understand this key system here, let's dive in a little deeper into the filtration membrane. All right, so we have zoomed in even more, and so here is the actual filtration membrane. And again, throughout the video, please feel free to pause and draw these too. I really find that it helps me as a student learn these concepts if I draw them out. So the filtration membrane, we can actually zoom in. We'll zoom in here. Here's where we'll start. And I know there's a lot of arrows. Ignore the arrows for now. We'll go over that in a bit. Let's talk about the anatomy here. So here's a part of just the arteriole going through the glomerulus. It's just any part. You can take any portion of this. It's all pretty much the same. And within this blood vessel, we have some red blood cells. We got some blue proteins, and I got some black triangles representing some platelets, okay? And then we have the 3 key layers, which I've zoomed in and we've drawn a little better here so you can actually visualize them better. And so the first layer, that the filtrate, and remember the filtrate wants to get from the blood vessel out to this space right here, which is where the filtrate will become the urine. And so to get to this, it has to cross 3 different layers. And so again, here's our first layer, is the glomerular endothelial cells of the actual blood vessel. The yellow right here is the basement membrane of the filtration membrane. And then here's a podocyte, and then here's its pedicels, or feet. And it has to get through all 3 of these tight junctions before it gets to the actual filtrate right here. And so then we have an empty space where we have the urine. And the only things that should be getting here is excess fluid and waste products. You should not be getting protein crossing this membrane, and that would actually result in a condition called proteinuria, which is pathological. So which would indicate maybe some type of damage in this system. And so then we'll have the filtrate in this portion here. And then we can zoom out. We have the Bowman's capsule again. So this is again the basement membrane of the glomerular capsule. And then the second part is the parietal cell layer that lines the inner lining of the Bowman's capsule. Okay, so let's talk about the pressure. So these pressure numbers, these are all pressures, and these are under normal circumstances. Okay, there's a lot of things that could change, but we're going to talk about normal kidney function. Okay, so I've drawn out arrows and in arrows. The out arrows represent the pressure to filter, and then the in arrows, anything facing towards the blood vessel, is representing pressure to reabsorb, so not filter. Okay, and so the natural filter pressure of the kidney in the arterioles, right, is 50 millimeters of mercury. So that's why I have a 50 going out of the blood vessel here. That pressure is the glomerular hydrostatic pressure, okay, and that would be 50 millimeters of mercury filtering the blood. There's another pressure, though. It's called the blood colloid osmotic pressure, and that would be because of the proteins that are located in this vessel. Now, the proteins don't necessarily like all their fluid leaving the vessel. They would rather it stay in, and so actually they exert a force of reabsorption, and they exert a force of 25 millimeters of mercury into the vessel to reabsorb the fluid. So it's working against the glomerular hydrostatic pressure. One more pressure that we have to keep in mind is this 15 out here, and this is actually called the capsular hydrostatic pressure. Right here. And as you can see, the Bowman's capsule, it is a firm structure. And so it does exert a force against filtration. And it's 15 millimeters of mercury. As it's farther away, it's not as intense, but it still does almost work against the filtration of the actual vessel. And so over here, I've made a nice chart for you guys. And so we have a nice chart here. So their overall pressure to filter, like we talked about, is the glomerular hydrostatic pressure, which is exerted from the vessel, which is 50. So that's 50 out, okay? And then the pressure to reabsorb is both the pressures in. And so we talked about the blood colloid osmotic pressure, the BCOP, which is from the actual proteins in the vessel, being 25 millimeters of mercury. And then you actually add that to your capsular hydrostatic pressure of 15, which is exerted by the Bowman's capsule. When you add those up, you actually get a reabsorption pressure of 40. And so now we have a filter pressure going out fluid to make urine is 50, and to keep everything else, keep the fluid and not make urine, is 40. And so your net filtration pressure is actually going to be 10 millimeters of mercury. So naturally, the kidney functions on a 10 millimeters of mercury net filtration pressure, okay? And of course, that's subject to change. For instance, if you have high blood pressure, there would be more blood coming through this vessel over here. And if you have more blood coming through the vessel, that would increase your glomerular hydrostatic pressure. It would increase your 50, which then, again, would increase your 10. So you could get maybe 20. So just things like that to keep in mind. But I hope that made sense with the whole pressure system and everything. And ultimately, that's how you make urine. And is that filtering of the blood through the 3 layers of your glomerulus, and you make your urine. And that is how pee is made. And so I hope this helps. I hope that you learned something today. Feel free to check out more videos of mine. We're going to be going over why you don't want to pee everything out and why your body wants to save some of the key nutrients in the next kidney video, if you want to check that out as well. I am the PT Guy, educating you on God's wonderful creations. I'll see you in the next one.